There was a time when some countries looked to Europe as a beacon of the future. For centuries, those countries across the planet measured themselves against Europe's standards, its laws, its cities, its idea of what constituted a good life. During that period, the continent was considered by many the intellectual and cultural center of the world, from music to literature, from legal structure to sports. Europe was the self-proclaimed leader and guardian of the modern era. But gravity is shifting. The old continent is still there. The pool is not. Europe's hegemony persisted for decades, but at a price mostly paid by the nations it colonized around the world. Then came the First World War, launched on the very land that ruled the continents, spreading the incurable sickness of mass death and agony to the entire world. It was only a few decades later that Europe was sick again. This time, the infection was racial supremacy and fascism. The war ended with an inevitable capitulation to the United States, economically, militarily, politically. In return, the US offered Europe a secure and prosperous public life, one that would flourish into a near-perfect model. But only under certain conditions did the US extend its patronage. Wars would stay distant, energy would stay cheap, global trade would stay open, and the US would remain the ultimate guarantor of Europe's security. For decades, the plan worked. It allowed Europe to rebuild and present itself as a new kind of global player. Not an empire, nor a military superpower, but a union of markets, rights, and rules. Europe did not need to dominate the world in the old imperial sense. Instead, it could regulate it, it could set standards, but that world is no longer. The European Union remains one of the largest economies on Earth, a vast consumer market, a major regulatory power, and one of the wealthiest social spaces in the world. But the question is no longer whether Europe is rich or attractive. It is whether Europe still has a say in the new world order. This is due to multiple crises. First is a declining economy. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the flaws of the EU's economic structure. The COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath made everything worse. Then, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 dealt the final blow. Not only did it shatter the illusion of Europe as a safe haven, but it also meant Europe could no longer rely on cheap Russian energy. The economic figures tell part of the story. In 2024, the EU economy grew far more slowly than those of the US and China. Europe's main problem is productivity, investment, scale, and technological depth. And now it needs hundreds of billions of euros in additional annual investment, just to keep up with Washington and Beijing. The continent that gave the modern world the printing press, the steam engine, the laboratory, and the research university now imports the architectures on which its own digital and industrial future will run. Most of the AI models used inside European institutions are American. Most of the EVs sold in European cities, beyond the shrinking domestic share, come from China. The problem is not a lack of scientists. Europe still trains some of the best in the world. The problem is that the capital, the speed, and the political appetite for risk no longer live on the continent. Chinese firms now dominate the supply chains on which Europe's own green transition depends. When Beijing tightened rare earth export controls, European industry discovered late how dependent it had become. Europe is not a leader in artificial intelligence. It is not a leader in advanced robotics. It is not a leader in electric vehicles, in batteries, in solar manufacturing, in next-generation chips. Its great industrial champions, German automobiles in particular, were built for an era that is ending. On January 27, 2026, after almost 2 decades of stalled negotiations, the EU concluded its largest ever trade agreement with India, explicitly framed as a way to reduce dependence on both Washington and Beijing. The deal is significant and revealing. Europe is no longer the center around which others adjust. It is a bloc adjusting to others, signing what it can, where it can, while it can. In recent decades, Europe, much like most of the world, has been steadily Americanized, in what some would call cultural imperialism, a trend of buying more, eating more, watching more, and influenced by a craze of isms, wokeism, tokenism, consumerism, you name it. Europe still does produce culture, but it overwhelmingly consumes someone else's. The continent that once preached to the modern world on how to think now increasingly thinks about itself in terms of borrowed trends like identity politics, diversity, and radical individualism. The result? Combined with an aging population, the idea of family has been rendered obsolete. Loneliness has turned into an epidemic, and the idea of me first has been normalized. And when you're taught that you matter the most, an entire set of moral values start eroding. Refugees are shunned, copies of the Quran are burned, Prophet Jesus is ridiculed on a Christian-majority continent. The most recent and striking example of this moral decline is the EU's response to Israel's genocide in Palestine's Gaza. Europe's moral decay and hypocrisy were exposed due to the deafening indifference and complicity of most EU nations. Besides Spain and Ireland, and several other countries that have recognized Palestine as a state, the Union failed to do anything more than issue vague and confusing denunciations, not unequivocally condemning Israel's textbook genocide, but only criticizing parts of Tel Aviv's atrocities. Maybe due to that very individualism it now worships, the Union seems to have lost its voice when faced with a global emergency, one that has been referred to as the most documented genocide the world has ever witnessed. The same Europe that built much of its post-war identity on never again chose to look away. This was not a failure of capacity. It was a deliberate choice, protecting its allies, even if that means standing on the wrong side of history. Europe's security still depends heavily on NATO structures and the US. European governments, from Warsaw to Berlin, from Helsinki to Paris, have recently been speaking the language of rearmament with a new urgency. This shift did not happen overnight, however. Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 showed that the post-Cold War security order was far more fragile than Europeans had assumed. The Syrian refugee influx of 2015 split the Union between those prioritizing human rights and those prioritizing security. Brexit damaged the image of a unified front and irreversible integration in 2021. And finally, the nail in the coffin, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This creates a divide inside Europe itself. For Eastern European states facing Russia most directly, the US security umbrella is not an abstraction. It is the core of deterrence. For France, and increasingly for other EU states, strategic autonomy is no longer a philosophical ambition, but an inevitable demand. That contradiction now defines the intra-relationships across the old continent. Mostly led by the Trump administration, the friction within the transatlantic alliance, once described as a community of values, has exacerbated its erosion. Together, the US and Europe betrayed the very international order they built, destroying what was once seen as an invincible solidarity. Washington's tariffs, technology restrictions, and demands for higher European defense spending have made it clear that the old collaborative language of that Euro-American relationship no longer captures the present reality. The US increasingly treats all alliances as transactions, and Europe is no exception. It can no longer assume that Washington's power will always be wielded in Europe's interests. Inside Europe, the political center is also under pressure. Far-right and hard-right forces have been gaining ground in several major member states. Anti-immigration parties have entered governments, shaped coalitions, and even set the terms others now follow. Xenophobia, once a word European leaders scorned, has infested Europe's streets and invaded its parliaments. More importantly, these far-right groups have changed the political language across Europe, mainstreaming a new era of racism and hatred. Center-right and even left-inclined parties have absorbed parts of their vocabulary. The new radical right is not always trying to exit the Union, however. Some groups want to reshape it from within. And the result is a more defense-oriented Europe, more focused on borders, control, security, and cultural conformity. Beyond its borders, Europe's influence is also weakening. In the global south, the EU is often respected, but not always followed. It is admired for its market, its universities, its regulatory standards, its quality of life. But admiration is not strategic alignment. Global South nations work with China on infrastructure, with Russia on security, with the Gulf on investment, and with Europe when it suits them. They've grown tired of lectures and regulations. They want options. Because the global order itself has shifted, power is more fragmented, alliances are more fluid, economic tools have been weaponized. Europe's institutions were designed for a different climate, one of predictably expanding trade, guaranteed US protection, and protracted legal processes. That world has not disappeared entirely, but it no longer sets the terms. This is not yet the total collapse of Europe. The problem is something quieter, something insidious. Europe is still rich, democratic, regulated, and generally attractive. But it has also turned into a reactive entity rather than a proactive one that responds to decisions made elsewhere instead of leading with vision and conviction. And that's partly due to its changing demographics. a shrinking and increasingly elderly population caused by dwindling birth rates. Europe is not dead, but it is sick, aging, and progressively detached from the new world order taking shape around it. Perhaps the plastics its politicians work so hard to ban have already poisoned the Union's bloodstream, and while the EU has not yet met its demise, the clock seems to be ticking.